Peace, my people. You're tuning into I Must Be Bugging, where Black, gifted, and otherwise neurodivergent folks celebrate our special flavors. If you've ever questioned your perspective in a world built for the masses, welcome home. I'm your host, Sheldon Gay, and I appreciate you joining me on this journey as a late-identified Black, gifted man. Together, we'll rewrite the script on neurodiversity by celebrating our differences, challenging the status quo, and breaking free from old narratives that label us as deficient. In each episode, we'll explore the stories, experiences, and of course the curiosities of Black gifted adults and other neurodivergent people who are underrepresented or unidentified in a world where normal can also mean harmful. So continue with me on this journey of self-discovery, empowerment, and acceptance. I Must Be Bugging is creating safe spaces, sparking conversations, and making sure our voices are heard. Welcome to the latest episode of I Must Be Buggin'. This is your host, Sheldon Gay. I am super excited today. You can probably hear the smile on my face. It's been a little while since I've chatted with you all. Plus, our guest today is someone I'm always excited to chat with. So again, welcome back, community. We've continued to have impact. I've been hearing a lot from folks about the impact of these episodes. And so today, I think will be yet another chapter in doing that. And so for those who aren't aware, again, my name is Sheldon Gay. My pronouns are he and him. Today, I am wearing a purple shirt, t-shirt. I've got on my over-ear headphones that are actually plugged into my laptop. I've got kind of medium curly hair, faded on the sides, and then I always tell people I've got this little tuft of this is my little tuft of hair, this little goatee that I've got going. And so let me first introduce our guest, and then I will let her kind of chat and speak about herself. So today, again, really excited. Got Kaitlin Smith here. Who is MSW. Kaitlin Smith, MSW, is a Boston-based scholar, facilitator, writer, and founder of Our Wild Minds, which offers online community and programs that help gifted BIPOC folks unleash their natural gifts. Kaitlin is also a PhD student at Harvard in history of science, where her research interrogates the history of mind sciences and intersections with African American studies. This research agenda is informed by past training and work as a psychotherapist at the UCSF Department of Psychiatry and in other settings, as well as continuing education in various critical paradigms that complement prevailing psychological paradigms, such as eco-psychology and gifted psychology. And so if you don't have goosebumps, I do. Kaitlin, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Sheldon. I'm so excited to chat with you today.
Yeah, this is going to be a great discussion. So to kind of get us started, I know I just read your bio, but tell us a little bit about yourself, the work that you're doing, and tell us whether or not you identify as neurodivergent.
Oh, goodness. Well, let's see. In keeping with some of the things that you shared about yourself to start, I use she, her pronouns. Today, I'm wearing a light blue dress. I think we're recording this in early March, but I think in mind, I'm like at the beginning of summer or maybe late spring. I'm just projecting myself into that future. I can't wait. And I've also got curly brown hair. It's pretty long, and I'm not sure what else to say on that topic, but I appreciate that question.
Yes.
Let's see. You were asking if I identify as neurodivergent. I do. I conceptualize giftedness as a form of neurodivergence, and that's the main way in which I identify as neurodivergent. I also think that I exhibit certain traits that are associated with with various forms of neurodivergence, namely hyperfocus. I think of hyperfocus as being one of my superpowers, though definitely it bites me in the butt from time to time. That said, I haven't yet found it useful to think about some of those other traits through the prism of ADHD or autism, but that
Hmm.
could very well change over the course of my life.
Hmm. Hmm.
But I appreciate the broad framing of neurodivergence that you employ on this show. I
Yes.
think that it's really helpful to, um, yeah, invite people to think about themselves in this unbounded way.
Yes.
Um, and just about myself and my work. I think you already shared a lot about me, so I feel like you've definitely done the heavy lifting. But just to sort of add to that a little bit, in addition to being an academic and someone who's leveraging my psychotherapy training to run my business, Our Wild Minds, I also write creative nonfiction and criticism. That's something I truly enjoy. Um, and then I also do some work kind of related to my writing, most of which is related to the natural world at this moment in time. And I have this smaller project called Storied Grounds, through
Mm.
which I sell some digital learning products for nature enthusiasts and herbalists. And I offer very occasional educational events related to public humanities and the natural world, folklore, and herbalism. So those are some of the things that I'm involved in at this juncture. And in summary, I'm just an extremely curious person and I love being alive and I'm excited to talk to you.
That's I loved every second of that. I one of the things that since we met however long ago that I appreciated as well is I think we both we're both very curious and open to exploring our identities around neurodivergence, I'll say, right? And so there are definitely some things for me that I'm also like, I don't necessarily identify as having ADHD or being autistic or any other neurotype necessarily, but there are certain pieces, and at some point, I mean, I've talked about this maybe in previous episodes, but I know it's interesting for me because I have found myself reading more and more literature that kind of blurs the lines between neurotypes, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And so I always appreciate it when other folks are just open to that because um, I think we can kind of limit ourselves in understanding who we are if we kind of block off labels and different things like that from the beginning, right? And so I appreciate that. And then the curiosity, that's like we've definitely got that in common, like so speaking of which, let me just jump into some of these things that I am curious about. So you talked about uh, some of your psychotherapy that you've been involved in before. Why don't you tell me like what kind of compelled you to kind of work on Our Wild Minds and some of the other things that you're doing now, as opposed to being kind of like having someone sit on your couch or something like that, I guess is a way of saying it, right?
Yeah, oh, that's a great question. And there's a lot to say about that.
Yeah.
I moved on from the psychotherapeutic field about 10 years ago now.
Mm.
So it's a fairly long story and there are a lot of chapters.
Okay.
But I guess I'll try to touch upon some of the moments and some of the themes that informed the direction I've taken.
Hmm.
One of the absolute one of the central themes in this journey from doing psychotherapy to doing this work that isn't quite therapy but is informed by psychotherapeutic training
Hmm.
was just the challenges inherent in trying to be a gifted therapist.
Hmm. Hmm.
This had so many components,
Hmm.
but one of them had to do with the misalignment I experienced with colleagues and with the
Hmm.
training process because I was basically being trained by neurotypical people from my vantage point to
Mm,
return
mm,
to this concept of neurodivergence in its broadly understood.
mhm,
And related to that, I also found it I found it really challenging to work with mostly neurotypical clients,
mm,
and I though there was a lot of richness in those working relationships, and there were a lot of things that I learned from the people who were training me and from my classmates and colleagues who were moving alongside me. It felt really clear to me that um, I was constantly receiving feedback that there was something effectively wrong with the way that I think and the way that I operate.
mm,
And
mm,
it felt unsustainable and ultimately unrewarding.
mhm,
And I'll also say that I became aware at that time that I was I was interested in doing work that offered a different kind of intellectual and emotional fulfillment than
mm,
experiencing through the work that I was doing. So that was one piece of the
mhm,
puzzle.
mhm,
Another related piece was racism.
mm. Yeah.
Um, I
Call it out. Call it out. Let me go. Go ahead. This is the place. This is the safe place to say these things. Go ahead.
yeah, I I guess there's just so much to unpack. It's hard to even know where to begin. But
Mhm,
um, I I guess one particular moment in my training process that really stands out and was a particularly formative experience was when I was undergoing my first year of field training as a
mhm,
therapist and clinical case manager. And my advisor um, basically came to the conclusion that I was too intellectual to be a therapist. So, again, that's kind of like one's concrete
mhm,
manifestation of giftedness colliding with
mhm,
neurotypicality in the psychotherapeutic field. But this
mhm,
person took it a step further and didn't just conclude that I was just too gifted in general, but
mhm,
that my giftedness was somehow a manifestation of me engaging in a deceptive performance that
mm,
was driven by a
mm,
desire to differentiate myself from other Black people.
mhm, mhm,
And she even concluded that if I couldn't somehow align my way of being, my way of speaking, my way of carrying myself with a mode that she thought was more authentic, and this is a white woman, by the way,
mhm, mhm,
she concluded that if I could not do this, that I was not psychologically healthy enough to be a therapist, essentially, and that she wouldn't be comfortable allowing me to graduate
mm,
because when you're training to be a psychotherapist, you're really becoming the instrument.
mhm,
And I think it is crucial that if someone is going to do that kind of work, it is so important to be able to look at yourself and reflect upon your own thought
mhm,
processes and your wounds and so on and so forth. In
mhm.
principle, I think that's really, really crucial. But in practice, this was an absolute shit show because there were all of these basic assumptions about
Mhm,
the
mhm,
world, about who different people must be in that world that were
mhm,
operating and shaping this person's understanding that were profoundly flawed. But there were
mhm,
also all of these barriers to confronting it, both related to racism and just this person's like utter cluelessness, but then
mhm,
also, giftedness. So this
mhm,
person and I were communicating and I think processing our experiences in these radically different ways that were
mhm,
colliding. So I feel that there was sort of this cumulative effect that made meaningful communication and resolution of these problems very difficult to come by.
mhm, mhm,
So those were some of the dynamics that came to the surface during that time that really got me thinking about whether the psychotherapeutic space is the best place for me to contribute my gifts.
mhm,
And I'll also say that I also encountered a lot of sexism and misogyny in the time that I
mm,
was training in the field. And one specific example that I can call to mind was that in one of my clinical field placements, I had a supervisor who's actually a woman of color, which is interesting.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Go
There's
ahead.
so much.
Yeah, so much. There is so much. This is like a whole topic unto itself. Go ahead.
Yeah. um, this person isn't black, but is a woman of
Mm-hmm.
color, and this person basically came to the conclusion that none of the work I was doing with my clients at the time, who were largely men, she concluded that none of it was really worthy of feedback, or legitimate as
Mm,
professional labor, because in this person's mind, the reason that I was getting positive responses from my clients and people were engaging with treatment was that they were just attracted to me physically, like sexually, and that it was
mm,
somehow impossible for someone like me, whatever that means, uh, to be someone who
mm,
can perform the modality or the intervention that psychotherapy is supposed to provide. And
mm-hmm,
it was entirely about like how I was showing up in space visually.
mm-hmm,
And I think that for me, the convergence of the three things I just talked about, the giftedness, the racism, the sexism
mm-hmm,
slash misogyny, it was just a lot. And
mm-hmm,
I think these forces, I think, suffuse our society. I think that there's really no outside, there's no escape from it. But I feel
mm-hmm,
that there's something about the act of being a therapist and needing to become an instrument for others and needing to really go under the microscope, in that process that made it feel untenable,
mm-hmm,
because the weight of these oppressive ideologies is just so great, and
mm-hmm,
deconstructing it is such, it's such a lifelong endeavor, and I think it's
mm-hmm,
something that needs to happen, on a host of levels simultaneously, and not just in the psychoanalytic or psychotherapeutic treatment context.
mm-hmm.
So, in short, or not so short, I just that, I'm not interested in working in a field in which I have to fight this hard every single day just to be seen, first of all, as a human being, seen as someone who can possess knowledge, someone who can be a professional, someone who
Mm-hmm.
can know something about her interior world in the field in which these things should be self evident to people, but are apparently not. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so,
Mm-hmm.
to make a long story as short as possible, gradually, after some of these events, it was clear to me that I needed to go in a different direction, but it took a while for me to figure out what that looked like,
Mm-hmm.
and to figure out what felt right to me. And
Mm-hmm.
also in that process, I began to kind of take dives of increasing depth into the literature on adult giftedness, and
Mm-hmm.
also pursued, some other continuing education, such as in eco psychology.
Mm-hmm.
And as time went on, I started to realize that I had a number of, I guess, unique insights into, what gifted experiences can look like for various
Mm-hmm.
populations that I didn't necessarily see reflected in the industry that serves gifted adults, and,
Mm-hmm.
felt like I feel like there's a gap here that I would like to help address.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yeah, I this is why again I was so excited and had the goosebumps up front because we haven't even gotten really even all the way into our conversation, but you've already talked about some really, really resonant and important things. So when you talked about what was one of the things that was interesting, excuse me, that you talked about was about this kind of disconnect between you know the neurotypical experience versus the gifted experience. And one of the reasons why this stands out to me is that one personally, but also through folks that I've had conversations with, one of the things that neurodivergent people in general have talked about is going to therapy and having trouble because folks are not thinking like us. And so a lot of the, methods, the perceptions even of what they're sharing are just not, you know, it's not aligning. And I know personally, upon reflection, as I approach my I've talked to you about my gifted birthday. As I approach what I'm going to call my gifted birthday, right? Like I think about the times that I've been in therapy in my life, and things haven't added up. And I've at the time I had no other explanation besides it was me, right? Um, and I kept going. I feel like I understand myself. I feel like I understand what's going on, but somehow this is not getting through. So, you talking about that, not only kind of putting myself in your shoes with your experience with it, but just thinking about how important it is, like for someone like you to be in that space and to be working in this kind of space. Like, it's funny to me to think that folks just don't see that, right? Like, it's just, how could you? It should, no, we need folks who can deal with that level of complexity, and thinking even further about the racism. um Again, we could literally have a whole conversation about this, but I'll just very briefly just say that with the racism and the sexism and misogyny or whatever, like that entire thing of how those converge, to me, again, goes back to some of the challenges that what I call melanated and marginalized communities face, where again like we'll say, look, we're pushing past stigmas, we're showing up, we're here, but you are constructing these spaces where the people that we really need to be in contact with, they're not here, or they're cutting off a piece of themselves that doesn't offer what the full package of what we need. And that is poignantly, like, harmful, when in a place where we're supposed to be doing healing. And it's so paradoxical to me. And I just I'm glad that you made the decision for yourself, that just wasn't what was a good look. It reminds me it reminds me of some of the challenges that I had. you know I mean, I have a mechanical engineering degree, and there are some things that I could have done. Oh, excuse me, I'm kind of dealing with a little bit of a cold.
Oh
But
no.
you know yeah, I had to have this conversation. But anyway, I it reminds me of, there are some things that I knew that I could do in mechanical engineering or engineering in general, but I looked at a lot of the work and I was like, long term, could I deal with a lot of this stuff? Like, I'll just share one quick thing that it reminds me as well. Like, I remember that was like my first co-op at Drexel. I think it was. There was an older black guy, and probably this time he was probably around our age or somewhere around there, right? Like, when I say older, I mean, he might have been older. I don't really remember now. Bottom line being is that he had been there for several years, and I just remember I was like, you've been here for several years, and they still have you doing these, like, what are, like, not quite entry level things, but certainly not senior level stuff for the amount of time that you've been here. And it stuck out to me because I was looking around the rest of the office and looking at some of these younger guys that I'm like, why is it that they're getting these jobs? Why are they getting to work on these types of contracts? And having conversations with people, that's not necessarily uncommon, that a lot of us will have credentials, we'll have experience, but we won't be given certain opportunities. And I was like, do I want to fight that, for the rest of my life? I don't think so. Like, there's other curiosities that I want to kind of dabble into, and there's other ways in which kind of my fundamental purpose in life can be manifest. And so let me kind of go carve out a different lane. So that's my long story medium, just in responding to what you said, which again I think was really helpful. And I think that I hope that folks really kind of take a lot from what you share, because it, it's it's not something that's necessarily intuitive, that people would think that would be something that people would have to face. But I mean, obviously, as you said, this stuff is pervasive. It's everywhere, and it's not something that we can easily escape.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. And just the other day, actually, I was in a class talking with some classmates and a professor of mine. It's focused on the history of psychotherapy, and I was just sort of sharing my perspective on this, which is that I feel that the issue of neurodiversity is woefully underacknowledged across the entire psychotherapeutic field. And if
Mhm.
you look at the Psychology Today psychotherapist directory, you can't indicate that you're searching for a therapist who specializes in work
Mm.
with uh,
Mhm. Mhm.
gifted patients. But I believe
Mhm.
that there is an area where you can indicate that maybe you're facing a certain kind of disability, which of course
Mhm.
is
Mhm.
really important. But I think that this awareness that giftedness um, introduces certain challenges and opportunities into people's lives that extend beyond their academic lives and into every other area of life is
Mhm.
something that is just slowly coming online.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
as challenging as it is to just notice how far we have to go in nurturing that understanding, it also feels rewarding to be participating in that. And it's so exciting, like getting to have this conversation with you and seeing this podcast and how powerful the conversations are. I
Yeah.
think we're moving in the right direction.
Yeah. No, I was going to say like I'm so glad that you didn't kind of totally pivot, right? Because I 100% know, not think I know. Like literally this morning, a gifted friend of mine messaged me, and he was talking about this common thing that we talk about. It's like essentially finding, community and finding spaces where I'm trying to remember the exact thing he said verbatim, but it was something along the lines of this feeling of, you know, consistently feeling like you're talking in basically into a void, into talking to people who just like they're not. I mean, I wish I remembered exactly what he said, but that was basically it. And it was like, I know what you mean, because there are times when you're trying to express yourself, particularly, there's this level past which, you get really excited, the depth and complexity comes out, and the people on the other end are like, mm, you know, what's going on with this person, right? And you're like, oh, I thought we were going to like really vibe, and apparently apparently I've kind of stepped in here. Yeah, exactly, exactly. So, um, I think that, like I said, with the work that you're doing in general, our Wild Vines, I think is, like I said, really, really powerful. And I'm actually, before I kind of move forward, can you tell us a little bit about what is eco psychology? Tell me a little bit about that, because I'm definitely curious about what that particularly means.
Yeah, thank you for asking. Oh, goodness. That's a tough question to answer because it's a pretty expansive tradition at this point, and different
Mm,
people take really different approaches.
mm-hmm,
But I would say that it's a subfield within psychology. And you could also say that there's a way in which it's a subfield within ecology. And it's sort of like a point of convergence between thinking about um, the ecological dimensions of the psyche. So, kind of like how we as human beings, with our psychological processes, are constituted in ecological space. And
mm,
we are. Um, our development as human beings is it can't really be disentangled from our animal
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
existence, if you will.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
So there's a lot of work that thinks about it from that direction. And then
mm-hmm,
at the same time, there are also people within the eco psychological space who are turning to more traditional objects of inquiry in the field of ecology and asking, how can we think this together with psychology?
mm-hmm,
So they will, climate psychology is one of the I would say subfields within
mm-hmm,
this area that
mm-hmm,
explores, yeah, what gives rise to climate activism or climate grief,
mm-hmm,
and how can we use that information to get people to take certain kinds of action. That's like I think
mm-hmm,
concrete manifestation. But yeah, I would say that work within the realm of eco psychology ranges from kind of like highly theoretical exploration of those convergences between ecology and psyche to
mm-hmm,
much more concrete strategies and interventions in the realm of ecotherapy. I
mm,
think one especially popular modality
mm,
that could be construed as a form of ecotherapy is forest bathing, or
mm.
shirin myoku. I'm not sure if that's the correct pronunciation, but are you familiar with forest bathing?
No, I was about to say, I was like, no, I don't think so. I'm bad with names, so I may have heard about it before, and then it's like, go ahead, go tell me, and then I'll say, oh yes, or I'll be like, no, this is really interesting.
Yeah, no worries. Forest bathing is this healing modality that's been gaining more and more ground, I think,
Mhm,
in the US. And I can't claim to be an expert on it, but my
mhm,
understanding of it is that it involves usually wandering into the forest with some sort of facilitator and
mm,
practicing slowing down and paying attention to the physical
mhm,
experience, or the embodied experience of being in the presence of
mhm,
these majestic beings, whether they're trees or other beings, and
mhm,
allowing the journey through the forest to be meditative and facilitate like an inward process. And I think there are often other components to it. I think there's sometimes a tea ceremony that's involved.
mm,
But forest bathing, I think, has grown in popularity, and I think there have also been some um, like empirical studies that have shown that engagement with modalities like forest bathing can help people experience better mental health and certain outcomes, which I think
mhm.
makes sense.
Yeah.
Um, but but the realm of ecotherapy is much more expansive than that, and
Mhm,
ecopsychology is more expansive than that as well.
mhm.
So if you imagine kind of like Russian dolls,
Yes. Okay. I'm
there.
with you. Yeah. I so first off, the joke that popped into my mind was you sound like my therapist only because
Oh no.
for a while for no, let me tell you why. Because I for several months, particularly I guess really last spring and summer, would take walks when I would be doing my therapy calls. And one of the things he was always calling me to do is to like observe my surroundings. And so I'd be, just like I said, just taking stuff in, and particularly some of the more challenging conversations, right? He'd be like, wait, can we pause here? Tell me what you're, you know, looking at. It also reminded me of this. I went to this retreat, this men's retreat a few months ago now. And again, one of the things was about, I mean, a lot of the stuff that you're just talking about, right? Just like this nature observation. I'll just say, like, I'm oversimplifying, so please don't take that the wrong way. But
No, no.
this is exactly it, and it does have you know impacts. And two other things that you said that are similar that I loved as well was when I think that it's very important for us as humans to acknowledge that we are animals, right? I remember being younger and that concept kind of first being introduced to me, right? Where it was like, oh, wait, we are animals, right? Like when we really think about it, the way we talk about stuff is that, animals are this completely separate thing, but it's like, no, like we have to acknowledge that that's what we are. And that is the nature of how, our mind and body kind of operate and manifest our experience. And when we do that, that kind of changes our perspective on a lot of different things. Which, to that point, I absolutely loved when you talked about trees and called them beings. Like that was
Oh,
like, I was like, yeah, like because again, this is a whole thing we can go into, but I'm sure that this is already on your radar. But for me, I increasingly am aware that again that there's this well, first of all, there's this I love this whole concept of like trees don't exist, right? Like I think that there's a lot of different things along the lines of how we classify different creatures and beings that again they're helpful, right? Like okay, I'm not gonna there's no such thing as trees if you go outside, but it's like at the same time when you take a second to say, well, let's go through that definition and what things actually fall into this category. I always give people the example of like finding the duck-billed platypus of life. Like, how many of those things can you find? And when you realize that those things exist, again, those categories are helpful. What's a mammal is helpful, but it's not an absolute. And therefore, like, we need to kind of keep our minds open to how we, just frame things. And so, again, just when you said that, I was like, yeah, like, I'm with you on that.
I love what you
Uh,
just, oh,
no,
sorry.
no, go ahead, go ahead.
I was
No,
just
go ahead.
going to say that I love what you just said, and it resonates strongly with me. I feel that the obsession with classification and putting things into categories is really unhelpful in a lot of
Mm-hmm,
ways. At the
mm-hmm.
same time, though, I also completely resonate with what you're saying about how it can feel useful to like have some sort of um,
Framework.
yeah, have some sort of framework or the idea that a tree might be a thing that exists while also being able to hold it loosely. Um,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, like I said, it, it, going back even to the point about how our mind works. Our mind is, from an evolutionary perspective, right? These categorizations, right? That stuff is built into us, right? Like, that's not it's not a bad thing. It's natural for our minds to want to go there, but even going back to this whole thing about giftedness, I think this is where, for me, is a quick touch point on, for me, what the difference between quote unquote being smart and being gifted is,
mm,
which is that it's not just this knowledge, it's this ability to deconstruct or see past what the knowledge is, if that makes any sense. And that's that experience where we will seem super strange. Like, I could talk about, like I said, if I went out and said there's no such thing as trees to people, to most people, or there's no such thing as fish, which I've heard people talking about, right? That would seem totally weird, right? But then if we were able to have an in-depth and complex conversation, you'd have to say, oh, wait, maybe you're right. Maybe that thing doesn't, maybe that's not really a very, like, fine-tuned thing. And so, anyway, like I said, I just really uh, appreciated you speaking about that, and talking about um, you know that aspect of this, because I do think the more that we realize that, again, we're not this completely separate entity from our world, right? Then, as you said, there are certain outcomes that come out of it. It's not like, oh, I have to save this separate world. No, I have
mhm.
to save this thing that's a part of my existence and the existence of, you know all these living things. And so, um so actually, let's this is sort of a good segue. I started talking about this a little bit. One of my next questions, tell us about this is actually tell us a little bit about our wild minds. This is like kind of going back a little bit. Actually, I was like, but tell me a little bit more about our wild minds, and how you came up with a name and what your vision is. I was going to talk a little bit about stuff for gifted adults and stuff like that. But let's first talk about our wild minds, because I think it's really, really uh, important for us to kind of dig into that.
Yeah, thank you for the question.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'll first just start by talking about the name, what's going on
Mm-hmm.
there. The name is actually kind of a riff on a related project I was working on several years ago that
Mm.
was focused on probing and dismantling various constraints on consciousness in different
Mm.
monsters and institutional spaces. So I think what you were just saying about thinking beyond categories and more expansively, I think really harmonizes with the spirit of that project.
Mm-hmm.
And in a way, Our Wild Minds, the business I'm working on now, constitutes a continuation of that work, but it's exclusively focused on gifted adults of color as opposed to a wider
Mm-hmm.
array of people and objects. And
Mm-hmm.
I feel that as gifted people of color, we're a population whose consciousness is often deemed pathological or baffling because it
Mm-hmm.
defies others'
Mm-hmm.
expectations and is thus interpreted as unruly and fundamentally unnatural, even
Mm-hmm.
in some
Mm-hmm.
way, and as though it requires some sort of explanation. And so when I'm using the word wild in this context, I'm trying to signal at once the naturalness of this way of being, as well as the multiple ecological functions of our expansive
Mm-hmm.
consciousness to the previous point, and
Mm-hmm.
despite its perceived unwillingness. So that's kind of what's going on with the name. And as far as the and the like, oh, sorry, you look like you.
No, no, no. Sorry, I was. So you all can't see, but I'm smiling. I'm shaking my head, and in my mind, I'm doing chef's kiss as you know you talk. Go ahead. So go ahead. Go
Oh,
ahead.
thank you. To talk more explicitly about the building blocks of this business and what's on offer, um, it's an online community currently, and I also offer some small group programs. The first of which is the Black Brilliance Circle, which will begin again in fall of 2024 for anyone who's listening and is curious about it. And one of the guiding assumptions of the work that I'm doing in this business is that racism and white supremacy have had immense impacts on the manner in which intelligence has been understood and constructed,
Mm-hmm.
not just
Mm-hmm.
historically, but into the present. And in this business, I am um, aiming to contribute greater skill and ultimately attention to social identity of various kinds, but particularly race,
Mm-hmm.
to the gifted adult, to the industry that serves gifted adults. And at this time, I'm exclusively serving gifted adults of color in an effort to ensure that the work that we're doing can be focused.
Mm-hmm.
However, in the future, I'm eager to build the capacity of the business to serve a wider array of populations of color who are gifted. So we'll
Mm-hmm.
see, what form that may take in the future. But that's what things look like right now.
Yeah.
And as you know, Sheldon, we're meeting every other week for a couple of hours to chat, and we have different themes for each month over the
Mm-hmm.
12-month period that are intended to offer every participant the opportunity to explore really important parts of our lives as gifted adults of color that are often hard to talk about in other spaces. And
Mm-hmm.
it's really meant to be a space in which every person can forge new friendships and find new potential collaborators and just be and come as we are.
Mm-hmm.
Um, One other thing I'll say about Our Wild Minds is that I'm currently operating with a 5-part model that I'm referring to at this time as the Wild Minder journey. The 5 pieces are introspection, connection, learning, manifestation, and giving back. And I don't envision this as a linear process at all, but rather more
Mm-hmm.
of a spiral journey where people can enter at any point and choose their own adventure.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some resources contained in the community that are meant to facilitate introspection, especially for folks who are perhaps unidentified as gifted or who are in a space where they're thinking, is this really for me? Does this really describe
Mm-hmm.
me? What does all of this mean for me? There's some resources to chew on around that. We also have ongoing opportunities to connect both asynchronously and in live conversation, and the Black Brilliant Circle program that I mentioned, and some resource libraries that are growing. There's also accountability buddy matching and opportunities for people to share the projects that they're working on and trying to bring into the world.
Mm-hmm.
And then we also have opportunities for people to connect with mentors and mentees. And also, one of the things that I'm really excited to do with our community is gather people around specific social issues of collective concern.
Mm-hmm.
I know that in a previous conversation, Sheldon, we chatted about one of those ideas, which is gathering people together to do kind of like a hackathon
Mm-hmm.
where we put our heads together and devise creative solutions or responses to a given social issue that impacts our demographic. So those are some of the ways that people are invited to engage with our wild minds at this time.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, and I will say firsthand. it has been, I wasn't certain what signing up would mean. And I just mean that just from a like literal, I didn't know, right? However, I am so glad. Like it was the absolute right choice. Let me just say it that way. Like no shade to any of the other gifted groups that I'm a part of, but our Wild Minds has affirmed that a space like this is really needed because I think the conversations that we have in there, the energy that's in there, the vulnerability, the kinds of ways that we can speak about our experiences is not something that I'm finding anywhere else. And again, that's not to say that anywhere else is bad or, but it's just, it's that extra bit, right? There's that extra, you know, flavor, that extra perspective on, you know, what it means to live um, as a gifted, you know, Black person, um, you know, that other groups just haven't been able to kind of bring out. And I love as well that there is this, you know, there's this non-linearity about it because I mean, we're gifted folks, right? So folks want to create their own adventure. If there was this very like step by step process, you know, it could be, maybe it could be amazing. But I think that at the end of the day, a lot of people will be like, well, I experienced this as a kid, like people trying to, you know, box me into this very linear thing.
Mhm.
I don't want to do that, right? So
Yeah.
I think you've done a great job of building out things that if somebody did want to whatever create some sort of path for themselves, fine, it's there. But if they do say I want to jump in this bucket today, next week I'm going to come into a completely different bucket that is totally unrelated, it's still there, right? It's still there. It still makes sense. It still meets a need. And so I encourage anyone who is curious to just take the plunge. Come join us if you identify as such, right? Like come join us. It's a great, you know, it's a great space. So um, yeah, I mean, like I said, I'm tomorrow we're having a call. I'm already like, you know, counting down to those that discussion, like
Oh.
super excited. So yeah, but yeah, I mean, I guess to that end as well, like, you know, I started touching a little bit about the needs of gifted adults, which you are looking to address directly. But what do you think about the difference in focus and support for gifted children versus gifted adults? Like, tell us a little bit about your thoughts on that.
Oh goodness. Oh. I feel that gifted children deserve all of the support and nurturance in the world. So I'm glad
Mm-hmm.
that
Mm-hmm.
there's increasing attention to that topic. However, I think that adults also deserve all of the support and nurturance in the world, and
Mm-hmm.
there's not nearly as much attention placed on
Mm-hmm.
that. I feel that there are so many moving parts to that, though. It
Mm-hmm.
seems to me that one of the contributing factors is that historically, so much of the research around giftedness has been concentrated in the field of educational psychology. And
Mm-hmm.
there,
Mm-hmm.
in my view, there's been this assumption that giftedness is only relevant to the trajectory of one's educational attainment and
Mm-hmm.
how they show up in the classroom, but that
Mm-hmm.
it's somehow not relevant to other dimensions of their life, like
Mm-hmm.
social experiences, their physiological state,
Mm-hmm.
um,
Mm-hmm.
their orientation to spirituality, just everything.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it seems like a real missed opportunity from my perspective that
Mm-hmm.
um, that there hasn't been as much attention in at least in sort of like mainstream popular discourse to what it can look like to be a gifted adult and the challenges and opportunities that come along with that. I
Yeah.
can also say too that I know that on this podcast you talk about your experience of having been unidentified for a very long time,
Mm-hmm.
and I I've so appreciated getting to learn more about your journey around that. I think, speaking as someone who's had a bit of a different experience,
Mm-hmm.
I was identified as gifted when I was in elementary school,
Mm.
and I feel grateful that I had that experience. Absolutely. At the
Mm-hmm.
same time, it's also very clear to me that it wasn't until, I would say, 10 years ago that I even contemplated the possibility that gifted adulthood was a thing to be
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
concerned about or curious about. And it was at
Mm-hmm.
that point that I think I read that book, Living with Intensity, that
Yes.
it's
Yes.
like a classic in this field
Yeah.
now. And then I feel like my discovery process around this has really come in waves too, even though I had that early um, label applied to me.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that it's been in the last several years, in the last 5, 6 years in particular, that I've really gained a lot more insight into what this means for me as an adult.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me that if there could be more attention paid to adult giftedness, it would help spare a lot of people some of those
Yeah.
difficulties. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I think you said it exactly right because I think one of the main reasons why I went so long without having that awareness is because I've been out of school. I mean, I finished grad school many years ago. No, I'm not. I'm not going to be embarrassed. I finished grad school in 2010, right? And so that was the last time that I was in a proper academic setting. And I could go on to stories about like reflections about how giftedness showed up there, but at some point, you it wasn't until, like you said, Living with Intensity was the book that was like, wait, this is not just can I calculate, can I, you know, use big words, which again is such a funny thing to me because I'm even thinking about corporate environment. There were people who made comments that I was trying to use certain words like on purpose, and I was like, "What?" Like I honestly, literally, at the time, I was like, it didn't make any sense to me. I'm like, "What do you even mean?"
yeah.
And retrospect, I'm like, "Oh, this is." They thought that this was like some sort of act, or I was like, okay, I read the thesaurus yesterday. I'm gonna try to come in here and like, I got to get my bang for my buck, like like. Like no, like I just no. So um but it's exactly what you're talking about. It's all the like even I'm actually, this is one of the things I was thinking about today or yesterday. I gotta add as a resource in there, The Body Keeps the Score, which is sort of a general book, for anybody to read, right, about just understanding how um our body is telling us about, how we're feeling, and, kind of just what's going on with us, right, in a way that um, we may not be aware. But that for me, again, was another book where it was like, oh, like when my body's feeling like this, and why does my body feel like this in these situations? So like even um, the whatever sound sensitivities or the whatever it is, right? Like it like kind of as a tangential piece to the Living with Intensity. It was like, oh, when I'm feeling like this, I'm not weird. It's not something to blow off. It's my body is telling me something about the data that it's processing, and I need to be aware of it. And that to me is the piece that a lot of people just individually, like I said, us as gifted people, but particularly those external to us don't get. They'll see us. um I won't say who I was talking to or what conversation this was, but there's a conversation I had relatively recently where people were, flabbergasted. And here's I'm going to use a funny word here, right? I mean, so people, I'm cracking up. So, right, people were flabbergasted at the idea that someone would be so put off by a smell that they wouldn't want to, attend a certain event or whatever. But if you know how smells can really impact people, it makes perfect sense, right? And so this is again a part of that existence where if you're not taking that into account as a part of your, who you are, you can completely miss it and instead see these things in um, a way that's not self-loving, I'll say, right? Not self-accepting. And so, yeah, I think it's, like I said, I think it's a really, really big missed opportunity. But I think that's another reason why I think our wild minds and all the work that you're doing is so important, because it's meeting people in that space and welcoming them there, um, to do that work and to say the things that they otherwise might feel like they would get looked at strangely for. Um, and we've talked about this a little bit, but I wanted to give you an opportunity. Are there any things, um, any challenges that you think that we as gifted people, especially Black and other melanated and marginalized people, like any particular challenges that you think that we face that you want to address through our wild minds that maybe you haven't spoken about yet?
Mm. Let's see. Mm. I have a few thoughts, or I have a bunch of thoughts,
Okay. Yeah,
actually.
go ahead.
Let's see. I think that one of the issues that I know that you speak about a lot on your podcast here are barriers to identification. So that's
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
definitely an issue. So something that I'm hoping that we can do is, as we grow this community, I'm hopeful that we can make more and more people who are gifted and may not know it um,
mm-hmm,
aware of the support that's available, and
mm-hmm,
that's really important to me. I also think about the phenomenon of misdiagnosis being a problem.
mm-hmm,
So
mm-hmm,
I think that
mm-hmm,
misdiagnosis of gifted people, including children, um, is a big problem. And I'm thinking of Dr. James T. Webb's book on this topic. I don't remember the full title, but it's something about misdiagnosis of gifted people.
mm-hmm,
I
mm-hmm,
think that for gifted people of color, there's even greater potential for misdiagnoses to occur because our population, even neurotypical Black people, face all kinds of misdiagnoses.
mm-hmm,
So
mm-hmm,
that's a major issue. Um, I also think about school districts. Even when people are identified as gifted, school districts often don't have the resources to support gifted
mm-hmm,
children, and that can be quite harmful. And I remember that recently that we also had a conversation about um, the merits and also limitations of gifted education, the
mm-hmm,
pull-out programs too. So there
mm-hmm,
are, I think, so many ways in which people are kind of hungry for opportunities for mirroring and connection,
mm-hmm,
and also intellectual stimulation, uh,
mm-hmm,
and also opportunities to plug in and um, you know make an impact so that other people, our brothers and sisters who are maybe similar to
mm-hmm,
us in these
mm-hmm.
ways, um, can also be lifted up and suffer less in the world that we're living
Yeah.
in. I think also about the relationship between these various dynamics that I was talking about, like the barriers to identification and misdiagnosis, thinking about that connected to the school to prison pipeline and carceral state.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
And there are these incredibly chilling statistics that indicate that gifted people are overrepresented in prisons by
mm-hmm,
just an unbelievable. Um, I'm struggling to find the word that I'm looking for, but thinking about the racial breakdown of the prison population in the U.S. and various
mm-hmm,
forces that perpetuate that, um, for me, it just raises so many questions, and I I deeply want to respond to that and explore ways that we can
mm-hmm.
respond to that as a community. I feel that it's a
Yeah.
really important issue. Um, um, Gosh, there are other. I'm just thinking there's so many
There's so many things,
challenges.
right? All the. Go ahead. Sorry.
I'm also just thinking about the problem of dealing with racist white people, honestly,
Mhm.
both
Mhm. Mhm.
outside of the gifted community and inside of it.
Mhm.
I feel that one manifestation of this is the expectation that Black people exhibit certain forms of intelligence, but not others. Um,
Mhm. Mhm.
I,
Mhm.
for example, I think that there's an expectation that Black people are all highly kinesthetically literate, you know,
Mm, mhm.
great
Mhm.
athletes, great,
Mhm. I love the way that you phrase that. Go ahead. Go ahead.
yeah, great athletes,
Yeah.
great dancers, highly
Right.
musical,
Mhm.
um,
Mhm.
and also hypersexual. I think that's part of
Mhm.
that discourse or that narrative. And
Mhm.
there's, I think, this notion that this high kinesthetic literacy or intelligence is opposed to intellect. And whenever
Mhm.
someone,
Mhm.
runs afoul of that binary, it produces confusion and can also produce
Yeah.
derision,
Yeah.
bafflement.
Yeah.
Um, and this is really hard to navigate. And like I said, I think that it's not just like in general neurotypical society, but also in some gifted spaces that I've been part of, unfortunately, where
Mhm.
people just can't seem to grasp that I know the things that I claim to know. And when I
Right.
say that I have a particular goal, it's not a joke.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was
No.
in I
Yeah.
was in a particular um, gifted space once where someone was the person who was running it was literally laughing at me expressing my goals
Mm.
and talking about the things that I am passionate about and happen to know a lot about, and that person couldn't grasp
Mhm.
that that could be true. And
Mhm.
it's just I feel that within our wild minds we have an opportunity to mirror one another in ways that are often not available in a lot of other spaces. And that isn't to say that
Mhm.
we don't have individual differences
Mhm.
throughout
Mhm.
or across the various members of the community. Um,
Mhm.
but I think that white supremacy is just so, and anti-blackness are just so pervasive, and they
Mhm.
run so deep that I feel
Mhm.
that spaces in which we can show up and imagine ourselves and one another outside of those strictures, or even just make gestures in that direction and just dream into that space. I feel that that's what we need, and that's part of what I'm attempting to offer and co-create with
Yeah.
people. um,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No. No. Sorry. Sorry. I was okay. Okay.
In response to your question about unique challenges that our community faces as gifted people, or that gifted people of color face, I also feel that um, just the internal politics of the Black community, I think, are also one of the complicating factors.
Mhm.
And I guess I
Mhm.
should be more specific when I say Black community. I'm thinking specifically of the African American community. One of
Mhm.
the things
Mhm.
that's been
Mhm.
quite rich for me over the last year has been getting to work with Black folks from all over the world, including people who
Mhm.
are not African American per se, and
Mhm.
learning from them about their experiences of Blackness and giftedness has been truly um, stimulating and really, really
Mhm.
rich. But as I think about the African American community, I feel that the whole discourse around talking white, quote unquote, and acting
Mhm.
white
Mhm.
is just really complicated and but also really harmful. And I think you were
Mhm.
saying earlier about people projecting their misplaced assumptions onto you about why you're using a particular word, or believing that
Mhm.
you reviewed the thesaurus before the you
Right.
like give to put on a show or something.
Mhm.
Really,
Mhm. Mhm.
you're a highly verbal person, and it's just who you
Yeah.
are.
Mhm.
It's not a performance.
Right. Right.
I also think about uh, I think outside of the African American community, just people struggling to examine their basic assumptions about the world and how they're inflected with racist ideas, like very like seemingly basic attitudes toward things like anger or
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
um, yeah. I think that there's just so many things that I found need to be deconstructed, and I'd really like to see
Mm-hmm.
more of that happening within the gifted um, within the industry that serves gifted people. And I feel that
Mm-hmm.
the critical humanistic disciplines have a lot to offer us in that endeavor.
Mm-hmm.
So I also see our wild minds as a space in which we can do some of that. And hopefully we can, in doing that, like birth some broader possibilities for ourselves.
Yeah. Um, there's not enough time for me to talk about all the things that you said that were like so on point. I think the underlying, theme just of, helping to, um, just again break barriers and help people to become aware of their schema, right? Because I think one of the biggest things, and for this, yeah, I don't know at which point people will be listening to this, but I've talked about my plan to do this series on the podcast about self-awareness because I think it's critical to like everything. And if you can create awareness around how you think about things and why you think the things that you think, like why would it even pop into your mind that a black person, from my childhood, it was, within the black community and otherwise, like, why would you think that it would be so crazy for a black person to want to be an astronaut? You know, my sport of choice was soccer or, football, right? Like, why is that? Particularly, it's one of the funnier things when you broaden beyond the U.S., right? It's like plenty of black people. I just what was AFCON was beginning of this month, so watching all these, the essentially, for those who don't know, AFCON is essentially the World Cup for African countries. That's sort of the very, very easy way of explaining it, and it is a tournament that's unlike any of the other tournaments that happen. But again, these are all African countries that are coming together. So like, if you step outside of the U.S., the idea that somebody would be like, "You don't think black people play soccer? Like, have you ever, where have you been?" Right? Um, but again, realizing, why do I think this? Why am I holding on to this thought? And how do I choose to shift is really, really, really important across all the things that you mentioned, because really that's at the root of a lot of these challenges, is just people not doing enough to investigate, how they're thinking about stuff. And um, you know, again, our wild minds is helping to create a safe space for us to investigate that, but also to create tools for us to go out into the world and rewrite those narratives. So, just wanted to kind of acknowledge that. I Before we go, and I don't know if you got a few more minutes, I do want to talk a little bit about, um, a couple other things I kind of had on here. Do you still have a little bit more time?
Yeah, I
Okay.
don't have to talk right
Uh,
now.
Great, 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 great. All right. Um, so the next thing that I want to talk about, which I read something, um, of yours that it enthralled me. I'll tell you. Um, but and it's well, anyway. Let me just ask the question, which is, I know that you're very connected to nature. We've already kind of touched on that, right? So how did you discover this connection to nature, and what do you think that others can, learn from maybe investigating that for themselves?
Oh man, I really appreciate that question. I think
Yeah.
there are kind of three pieces of my personal background that I'll quickly mention, and then
Hmm.
something else. I think
Hmm.
one part of how I became aware of this connection was that my father was a really avid um, gardener and plant lover, bird
Hmm.
lover, and he often had me in the garden with him when I was little. kind of serving as his helper. So that kind of laid a foundation for me. Um, I would also say that I've been studying nutrition and herbalism for many years now, and it's been kind of like a foundational part of my lifestyle, at least since I was in college. And eventually, those interests expanded to encompass more direct connection with the natural world, where I began sourcing certain foods and medicines instead of just getting them from the health food store or purchasing them from an online herb supplier. Um, so that's also a big part of the story. And then another part of the story is related to eco psychology, which I know we chatted about already. But in short, it's hard to say exactly where that interest came from, but I think that it was shaped by some of my academic explorations and also my spiritual path. Um, so I think that those various parts of my background kind of set me on the path to being interested in connecting with the natural world. But I would pinpoint a specific moment about 10 years ago as being kind of like an important turning point for me in getting really like much more curious about the natural world and feeling much more drawn to engage with it consistently. Around that time, 10 years ago, I started to receive these flashes of creative inspiration, for lack of a better phrase, for a book that I'm now writing, actually, which is a hybrid work of memoir and criticism that includes quite a lot of nature writing that's kind of central to it. But when I actually sat down to begin writing it 10 years ago, it became evident to me that I hadn't yet become the person who could write the book, or I couldn't finish it because I simply hadn't cultivated the depth of relationship with the natural world that the project seemed to demand. Even though I had this knowing that it was my story to tell, but my actual real life hadn't caught up to the story. That makes any sense. So yeah, so it wasn't immediately clear to me what I could do in that moment to align my reality with this vision that was emerging. But I do remember that period as being really significant in like beckoning me in this particular direction. And then a turning point came in 2020 when my father passed away, actually, and then I moved back to Ohio, where I grew up, for a few months. And in short, during that time, I began apprenticing myself to the natural world, and in an effort to just navigate the grief and a number of compounding questions I was facing at the time. And this coincided with a bunch of mysterious experiences. And at the same time, I also began immersing myself more fully in the study of various kingdoms of life, and also just spending more time in the forest. And prior to that, I'd been living in Cambridge, Massachusetts, for a while without a car, and like living this hyper urban life in a certain sense. Um, and so that was a turning point for me, and it ultimately led to me leading outdoor events for this organization called Outdoor Afro, and then eventually creating my own small business slash project called Storied Grounds. And at some point in the course of all of those events, I realized that I had started to become the person who could write the book that I was envisioning, and that themes related to the natural world were really important ingredients for me in the work that I feel I'm supposed to do. But my understanding of what that work is ultimately about continues to evolve and acquire greater depth and complexity over time. But for me, I would say that it's ultimately been that sense of inspiration and kind of like a creative calling or pull that's kind of led me into that world of doing things in the natural world and teaching people about it. And as far as what other people can learn by engaging with the natural world too, I feel that there's so many possibilities. But just a
Yeah.
few that come to mind are I think that by spending more time in the outdoors and accessing educational materials related to it, you can learn to access some of the most healthful and affordable food and medicine on the planet. I think that's a big deal, especially in the world we live in
Mm-hmm.
today, where
Mm-hmm.
food injustice and barriers to food access are pervasive, especially for
Mm-hmm.
particular populations. So I think that's a really important opportunity. Um, I think that there's also the opportunity to enlarge our sense of our role in the ecological landscape and a sense of our smallness in kind
Mm-hmm.
of like a vast, more than human symphony of life. And bird
Mm-hmm.
language is one of the specific disciplines or practices that I find really enjoyable for embedding that kind
Mm-hmm.
of understanding in my consciousness. There's some great books that you can find. There's one in particular that stands out called What the Robin Knows, that is all about bird language. And there's some other really cool resources out there.
You can't be giving me these like now I'm gonna be okay. I'm gonna be on the Robin tangent. Okay, bird language tangent. It's going to happen. Okay,
Yay!
sorry. Go ahead. Go.
Yay! That's great. And then I guess really quickly, some of the other potential
Mhm.
learnings that I think are on offer for folks who are curious about maybe connecting more with the natural world is the opportunity to immerse yourself more in the life cycle and witness it,
Mm.
the cycle of living and dying, and see yourself
Mhm.
in that cycle. I think there's also a chance to deepen your interoception, like the ability to
Mhm.
learn from your own body through the act of moving around on the landscape in some way. And I think, especially if you're
Mhm.
eating from the landscape, noticing the sensations that you feel and the interactions you have with these other life forms or beings, I think can be really powerful and expansive.
Mhm.
Um, and then finally, I think learning the folklore that corresponds to the place where you live and other knowledges that pertain to that place, um, and like weaving it into your own story is something that I found to be really powerful and something that I'm working on in the context of my writing project, and found to be really rich and that I think can be rewarding for people, especially people who are looking for a deeper sense of belonging and who perhaps
Mhm.
experience displacement, and want to feel more at home where they live.
Yeah. Yeah. I thank you for sharing that. I'll put it into the show notes. There's an article that you wrote about acorns, and it's not like it sounds funny. It's like an article about acorns. Like, what are you talking about? But I loved the way that you connected. I mean, really everything that we've talked about, but really this sort of um, the nature aspect, like because I think in there you talked about making like acorn flour, right? I think that's one of the things you talked about,
Yeah.
right? So I'm thinking in my mind about shoot, go out here right now. I can probably find some acorns, stuff that you walk over, you might step on and not even think twice about, right? But like, how is this thing connecting us to this planet? But then, like you said, the indigenous traditions, like the I'll put the article in there because otherwise I'll be sitting here talking about it for the rest of this call or the rest of this conversation or whatever. But um, you know, the other part that I was put in there is that but it also was talking about this sort of macro level of anti-capitalism, anti agricultural harm that we experience, and how is this kind of like at play and interconnected, which I think is really interesting because as you said, we're kind of a part of all these different systems that were there when we were born, right? So it's like, okay, these systems exist, and when we become aware of how they interplay, and sure, there's some benefits but there's also some harms, like how do we like reconcile those things? I think it's just a really what you wrote was, like I said, really really interesting along those lines, but I think it's an interesting point that I'm grappling with myself, as I think about even meat eating. I'm definitely a meat eater, you know still at this point, but I'm always thinking about, excuse me, how to operate in that space from a more, um, a less harmful way, right? Because I've even thought, at some point, like, Sheldon, would you ever like have a farm, or would you ever, do something where, again, I'm not going to necessarily raise cows and all this other kind of stuff. Like, that's probably not going to happen. But maybe I have a chicken coop, and that's where I get my eggs, right? I definitely, future thinking, do want to have some sort of, garden. I mean, I can go on for days about how when I was younger, I don't think my uncle listens to this podcast, but um, I am kind of throwing him a little elbow here, because I remember when I was younger, I had been given some, like, uh, I forget, I think it was for school or something like that. They had given us these different seeds, and like corn was one of the things. They were like, "Oh, go plant this, and you can plant this here, and it'll still grow." So I was like, "Oh, cool." And he gave me space in his backyard to plant it. And long and short, I came back, I don't know, however long it was, like, let's say a couple months later. I'm like, oh, I got to his house. I rushed to the back. I'm thinking, oh, there's going to be this, that thing had died. He
Oh
hadn't taken care of that
no.
thing. So I was like, wow, okay. Um, so, I've mostly healed from that,
Oh,
but it just reminded me about, you know, I was still, it just spoke to the wonder that I had around the growing things, and this interconnectivity between, um, like I said, just getting there with your hands. Like, I'm not somebody who is thinking about this as, from a landscaping point of view, right? Where I'm like, oh, I just hired somebody to make this thing look good, or whatever, whatever. It's like, no, if I'm going to do a garden, like, I want to get in there and be mindful about, how all this stuff comes together. And so again, your writing, and again, what you're talking about has really reignited a piece that already existed, but also expanded my mind to some things that I wasn't even uh, aware of. And um, to that point, one of the last things that I'll just ask about really quickly is, what I appreciate. One of the things I appreciate about you is that you have this connectedness to possibilities and wonder, which we've already touched on. But has that caused any challenges? Which I guess to some extent you've alluded to, at least a little bit, right? And then, you know, how are you leveraging that, connection to possibility and wonder, for your future vision of what you want to do?
oh, thank you for that question. I love that question. Um, yes, I would say that I definitely have encountered some challenges that stem directly
Mm-hmm,
from my orientation toward possibility. I found that a
mm-hmm,
lot of the people I interact with don't necessarily see the possibilities that I see or respond negatively to me expressing my
mm-hmm,
attitudes about those
mm-hmm,
possibilities, and can sometimes get
mm-hmm,
really taken aback and offended by my natural thought processes.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
That said,
mm-hmm. I'm with you.
I like to play with ideas in the same way that children play with toys,
Mm-hmm,
and
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
just because I'm playing with an idea doesn't necessarily mean that I'm wedded to it. And a lot of people
yeah.
don't realize that. And you could say that
Mm-hmm,
I tend toward intellectual promiscuity. That's a phrase that I've begun
mm-hmm,
adopting. For
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
example, I responded to an unexpected question on a panel that I was on in the last year, in the spirit of playful exploration of a given
mm-hmm,
intellectual position, and found that one of my conversation partners responded quite strongly and fairly negatively. And a learning for me in that was that sometimes I kind of skip steps and don't convey my thoughts in ways that
mm-hmm,
a lot of other people will follow. So I think
mm-hmm,
that's an area where I can improve and just be more effective
mm-hmm,
in conversation. That said,
mm-hmm,
I also know that I seem to have a different orientation to possibilities than a lot of other people, and I see exploration
mm-hmm,
of those possibilities as a mostly amoral activity. Um, but I notice
mm-hmm,
that some people are so personally identified with certain immovable positions that they're just
mm-hmm.
unwilling to get curious about divergent ideas, their own or anyone else's. And I'm also aware that as my professional roles and visibility shift over time, I may need to revisit how I play with ideas, um, in public space, on the public stage, given the potential impact of doing so, and also the expectation um, that I show up as someone with a more or less unchanging platform as an academic, um, that's readily legible and uncomplicated. So to be continued. Um,
Right.
but as far as how I'm kind of leveraging this orientation to possibility and wonder in my vision for the future, or my own future, I'm just thinking really expansively right now about my career as a scholar. I envision teaching in the academy and ultimately producing scholarly writings, like scholarly books.
Mm,
Alongside that, I'm also eager to continue supporting and in the future mentoring gifted people of color via our Wild Minds. Um,
mhm,
as I think the overwhelming majority of gifted people of color will not necessarily ever be my students at a college or university where I teach in the future.
mhm,
And I don't feel
mhm,
comfortable limiting the work that I do only to the people who are able to access, that form of education,
mhm,
um, and
mhm,
that's inaccessible to a lot of people. Um, I also plan to continue doing public facing writing, including the memoir project I mentioned that I've been working on. And then a final ingredient that I'm envisioning is working on some media projects in the future that could help bring
mm,
my research and other insights drawn from my scholarly field to a popular audience. But I don't
mhm,
really have more that I'm prepared to share on that topic right now. Um, those are kind
mhm,
of like the four ingredients that I'm envisioning. And I know from sharing this with different people that sometimes people are like, wow, that seems like a lot, perhaps too much. But part of why it's really important to me to especially pair the work that I'm doing with Our Wild Minds with my work as a scholar is that I'm aware that there are some people who support others within the gifted field who don't always feel like they've been able to follow their dreams, felt
mhm,
blocked in certain ways. And I have a lot of compassion
mhm,
for that. But I also think it's hard for people who are not actively following their dreams and doing whatever is necessary to live their dreams to support other people in following their dreams and going big. And
mhm,
I so I feel that it's really important that there are people who that we have people from like all walks of life and people who are um, offering leadership in different cultural arenas, providing support
mhm.
to other people, and yeah, lifting while we climb, so to speak. Um, so that's how I'm envisioning my future.
Yeah, that. So I was sitting here as you were talking, trying to find the right words to say about this, but I'll say it this way, and I think you'll understand what I mean when I say that what you just shared to me does not seem too big. It doesn't seem like a lot per se, right? Sure, there are many facets, and I know that you are ambitious about those things, but I think that one of the key things about the way that you're operating is that it's about community. So it's not like you're doing everything unto yourself,
Yeah.
right? Your vision is your vision. It is expansive, but it's not, you know, Caitlin's island,
Yeah.
right? And so um, I 100% agree with you as well to that point that there are a lot of us, and again, going back to me, like there are times when, and a lot of folks, gifted folks in particular, but I guess neurodivergent folks in general, who have this experience of shrinking, and thinking that I can only set my bar X high because of whatever, like I said, any multitude of reasons, um, and being somebody that says no, like again, we can do these things. I'm going to push to do these things, and um, there is something bigger than me, and we're going to do it together. Like again, using words like co-create, because again, this is not just it's not a dictatorship. We don't, it's not the vision from upon high, and that's it.
Really?
Um, I, you know, uh, even going back to talking about playing with these ideas. What you even envision today may not be what ultimately in a year or two it ends up looking like. But it's not about that. It's about just pushing our limits, which again I think is really is super critical work, and very much so aligned with, as I've told you, and I've shared this with others, like kind of my mantra, or not just my mantra, but one of the key things that I'm super leaning into right now is this knowledge of myself that chaos is how I learn, which is a phrasing that I stole from Strange Planet the comic, but like chaos is how I learn. I realize that like I'm playing around with stuff. I'm always looking to just like take something, turn it on its head, and just be curious about a different angle and how stuff works. And like you said, there are some people for whom those concepts, those beliefs, those ways of doing are so ingrained and so unexplored that it is really scary. And so having awareness about how we show up in that way is important, but I don't think that we should um, completely turn it off. Is sort of the short story.
Mm.
So um, I look forward to seeing, how all this stuff plays out. My very last question is, and maybe tell me one or two things. And this is actually kind of a good segue. I'll just kind of skip to this. There's like one or two things that you wish the world knew or built more capacity for.
I love that question. Let's see. I think one is that the gifted label need not be a mark of arrogance or superiority.
Mm,
It simply denotes
mm-hmm,
an
mm-hmm,
atypical sets of needs and capacities that call for particular forms of support and nurturance, in my opinion. In
mm-hmm,
addition to that, giftedness doesn't necessarily imbue someone with all of the tools that they need to solve every
mm-hmm.
challenge they could possibly face. Gifted people
Absolutely.
need support and encouragement as well. And that's why it's so wonderful and important that this podcast exists, and that various other gifted spaces exist and are emerging.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
A
mm-hmm,
second thing is that I feel strongly that the living world we inhabit is brimming with forms of intelligence and mystery that evade definitive explanation and total description through preformed models.
mm-hmm,
And I feel that
mm-hmm,
if we could collectively internalize this truth alongside actively dismantling, racist and other oppressive ideologies, even in their subtle forms,
mm-hmm,
I feel that it might be easier for people to encounter people like you and me, Sheldon, and say, why,
mm-hmm.
of course. Instead of,
Right, right.
I can't place you in my narrow
I
understanding of what the world is, and therefore you can't be real, which is something I've really heard
yeah,
from multiple people.
yeah, yeah.
I think the truth is that we,
I dream of
we
that
are
day.
real. Let's
Yeah,
do this
right.
thing.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Sorry, did I cut you off? I didn't.
No,
I
no,
didn't
no,
mean. No.
no.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I'm. Thank you so much for saying that. I obviously 100% agree. I think it's so important, and that we just push those limits and help. Again, what you talk about is fundamentally what this podcast is about. It's about humanizing the gifted experience. We're not things to be uh, idolized. We're not creatures that are so otherworldly or alien that we can't be related to. We don't have all the answers, which, again, for those who, if you are gifted, you may find yourself thinking that that's what the expectation is. is that you have to have all the answers. If I'm not good at, you know, there's people who can learn 25 different languages, and that's great. That is not Sheldon's thing. I'm gonna tell you that right now. I'm pretty good at, you know, you know, hearing certain languages and like whatever, but I'm not. That's not my thing. And in a similar way, where I might be really good at whatever, like math, that might not be somebody else's thing. That doesn't mean that either one of us is not gifted, and it doesn't mean either one of us is better or worse than the other person. Um, and so, again, just creating a more realistic and humanized experience is super, super important. And again, I think it helps everybody, because when we can understand ourselves, we can understand others. And so, yeah, thank you so much again for your work here. And to that end, I mean, you've kind of mentioned a lot of different stuff. Is there anything in particular that's coming up that you want to mention about any of the work that you're doing? I just want to give you space to mention
Thank you. Yeah, I'll just
that.
say that at the time that we're having this conversation in early March 2024, we are just beginning our month within the Our Wild Minds community that's focused on physical sensitivity and health. So anyone who's part of this demographic, who's interested in having conversations around that, please feel free to join us by going to ourwildminds.com. And there you can join my mailing list by clicking the subscribe button. And there you can also find links to all of my social media accounts, where you can also stay abreast of the latest developments.
Great, great. Yeah, no, I'm gonna put all of your links into the show notes. Our Wild Minds is already a mainstay in the ongoing show notes, because it very much so aligns. Like I think I told you the other day, like I see myself as kind of a feeder into the community, into the work that you're doing. The more people that we bring awareness to, the more people that feel safe in identifying in this way, the more folks that we can put together to create the community that you've described. And so, thank you so much for making this time and sharing, all the different things. I must say that, we're definitely, if you're open to it, going to have you come back and dig into some more stuff. So, but yeah, Kaitlin, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Sheldon, and I would love to come back in the future. I feel like we covered a lot of ground, but there's also still so much more that we could have talked about. So,
Yeah,
yes, to be
yeah.
continued.
That's Yes, absolutely. Thank you for joining me for another episode of I Must Be Bugged. I hope you've learned something, became curious, and most importantly, felt affirmed by what you heard. Remember, this podcast is all about sharing compassionate narratives about who we are and how we contribute to the beautiful and necessary diversity of humanity. This is our place to unmask and just be. Don't forget to connect with me on IG at I Must Be Buggin', where I'm eager to see you share your thoughts, your experiences, and your stories. And if you've enjoyed today's episode, please share it with a friend, leave a review, and subscribe. It helps others who are eager for community find our people. So thank you again for being a part of the I Must Be Buggin' community. I can't wait for the next episode. Until then, stay up and enjoy who you were meant to be. And remember, you're not bugging, you're brilliant.